Everyone for coming. We have both Democrat and Republican conferences and caucuses are involved in all kinds of activities on the Hill right now, so the staffers who are here are very valuable. We appreciate your time, and I think that you'll find after listening to Professor Keene's presentation that your time here is well spent. When I first heard him several weeks ago, it really opened my eyes about the current situation we're in economically and some of the questions that aren't being asked. So I hope that when you look at this, you'll take some of these questions back to your members and the committees and let them know that these are things that ought to be considered. This is Dr. Keene's a very popular economist. He's in big demand all over the world. He's developed a very advanced way of analyzing economic data and showing what it's telling us. He's a professor of economics and finance at the School of Business at the University of West Sydney in Australia. He's in big demand because he's one of the few economists who predicted the 2007 financial crash before it started. Now, how did he do it? Well, he looked at the data. He went public and warned the world that a financial collapse was imminent back in 2005. And for this he was awarded what was called the Revere Award for his early warning. Professor Keene's analysis is often sought after by the media and by hedge fund managers and others who are involved in financial markets. His recent book, Debunking Economics, The Naked Emperor Dethroned, exposes how far economic theories have departed from reality or relevance. Yet these are the theories that are often used to advise governments around the world, including our own government. Now, he's going to present his empirical analysis of today's economy and compare it with the period before and during the Great Depression. Using this analysis, Professor Keene will show us some lessons that hopefully we'll be able to learn to help us avoid the mistakes that were made in the Great Depression. So without going further into his presentation, which he will do, Professor, welcome. And again, I want to thank all the staffers who are here. This is a very valuable presentation, and I think that you'll members of the committee, which will be useful at this time.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dennis, and thanks for coming along. I hope to make it both worth your time and hopefully interesting as well, because clearly the fiscal cliff is a new phenomenon for the American Congress. One thing I've always had as a defining feature of American Congress is it's a place where nothing happens in great detail. In other words, there's such a degree of logjam normally that things just don't occur. But now what you've set up is a situation where if you don't make a decision, something will occur, which is quite an intriguing shift on the past. And I want to go through a number of quick oversights I'm going to go through here that make the analysis I'm giving you different to what you'd be getting from the Congress Budget Office and getting from economists at either end of the political spectrum. And that is because I see understanding banks, debt and money is key to knowing where this crisis came from. And the crazy thing is, for people who haven't done an economics degree and they haven't been schooled in this whole way of thinking, is that most people who are non-economists think that economists are going to be experts on money, and obviously on banks and debt, because banks manage the money. So you'd think that that'd be the usual story. You're an economist, you must be an expert on money. Well, even the most radical of mainstream economists ignores banks completely. This is a recent debate I had with Paul Krugman on the blogosphere. And in reference to one of my papers, he wrote, he's all for including the banking sector in stories where it's relevant. But why is it relevant to a story about debt and leverage? Now if that's the most progressive of the conventional economists, the other extreme, the ones he normally fights and he calls freshwater economists, completely ignore not just banks but instability in every possible last manifestation. So that's the range of debate you've been getting largely in Congress, and that's as far as it's gone to analysing the banking sector. Now I see them as crucial because in a very, very simple way, and it does make sense to think about this at the sort of small bank level in your own personal accounts, because banking does aggregate. What you do at an individual, contrary to what conventional economists think, does aggregate to the national level. So your own spending, you can spend money either out of your income or out of swiping a credit card. Exactly the same thing aggregates to the national level. The reason that economists don't consider what I consider here is they wrongly believe it doesn't aggregate. And they think one person's increase in borrowing means they have more spending power, but the person they've borrowed from has less spending power, so they cancel it out. Now that's would be correct if we didn't live in a world with banks. And if to actually borrow money, I had to go and take some money out of Dennis's pocket, and therefore Dennis couldn't spend, whereas I could. That would be a legitimate reason to leave it out. That's not how the banking sector operates. So by making that mental cancellation process, that's why conventional economists miss the importance of the crisis. Now, when you put that together, what it does, it changes the basis of macroeconomic thinking. And the key way that it changes it is that if you look in an accounting sense, it's true that recorded expenditure equals recorded income. And even some of my non-orthodox colleagues use that as a reason to also ignore the banking sector. But when you look at it from the point of view of what you can spend as an individual is your income plus the change in your debt, and because the banking sector can create that spending power without taking it away from anybody who's saved money, it aggregates to the national level. So at a national level, what I argue is the effective demand, the actual monetary turnover that finances buying goods and services and also buying assets, is income plus the change in debt. Therefore, you've got to analyse the dynamics of debt to know where the crisis came from, and that's why I saw it coming, because I do look at debt in a way that conventional economists don't. And it gives you guidance to what the future might hold. Now I'm going to go backwards a bit in history. This is one chart that, in trying to make the 14-page limit I was given for writing this presentation, there's one slide I had to drop. This is a long-term look at the ratio of both private and public debt to GDP. Now when we're talking now about this crisis, people have been saying for some time it's like the Great Depression. But I want to show why it really is like the Great Depression. This is the ratio of both private and public debt to GDP for the last pretty much century. And you can see that huge spike back in the Great Depression for the level of private debt to GDP, and we're higher this time. And equally you can see that the public sector debt was well below private sector debt there, and then started to exceed it during the Second World War, obviously. Over here we're seeing rising public debt after there's been a trend for it to fall pretty much for the last 15-20 years. So there is a genuine reason why we can compare the two periods, and what I'm going to now do is go into the actual dollar numbers behind those two ratio charts. So what we had, first of all, we did have a fall in GDP. If you look at the blue line is the inflation adjusted GDP. Well, that should be, it's red on my computer, it's black on your screen there. That is the nominal dollars, and you can see that there's, we date the recession as starting from pretty much the beginning of 2008. That's the NBER's formal date for the start of the crisis. Then you can see when that happened, a trend for rising GDP gave way to flat in real terms, and then a fall. In terms of nominal prices, there was a bit of a dip, and then a bit of a rise, and then about a year later, GDP started to fall. Now looking at that, clearly it's a fall in income for the entire economy. It matters, but I think you can tell just by, even without me showing you the other chart, that's nothing like what happened in the Great Depression. So, you know, why do we make the comparison? Well, this is where you have to start looking at the debt levels. Now this chart shows you both GDP, which is the dotted line, government debt, which is the thing which everybody's obsessing about inside this building, and private debt, measured in trillions of dollars. And now you can see something peculiar about the private data. First of all, private debt is far greater than public debt, and also far greater than GDP. The ratio at this point of private debt to GDP was 303%. Okay? Even now, we're still approaching the level where public debt is 100% of GDP. And that's after a period of rising public debt. But it's still far, far lower than private debt. And you can see that the trend was, this actually goes back virtually forever. If I go back right to 1952, all the way through, I'll show rising private debt. It has not fallen in nominal terms except when this crisis began, since the Great Depression. That's the first time private debt's actually fallen in absolute value. So let's now start analysing this and start looking at it in terms of the change in debt, because my argument is that income or effective demand is a GDP plus the change in debt. So I'm now going to break down looking just at GDP. So the top line now is GDP, but the red and the blue lines, or red and black line for you, are the change in public debt and the change in private debt. Now here you can see the change in private debt per annum. The annual increase in private debt was running at least $2 trillion a year and peaked before the crisis began at over $4 trillion increase in 1 year. Now that's on a $14 trillion economy. So from my point of view, the increase in private debt that particular year increased demand over what it would have been from income alone by almost 30%, which is huge. Then notice how this downturn coincides with the beginning of the crisis. And you go from a period where private debt was adding over $4 trillion to our aggregate demand, from my point of view, to subtracting $3 trillion from it. Now we're talking serious numbers. Now you can see the scale and why this was thought to be such a huge crisis when it began. Public debt, on the other hand, a bit of a rise after 2004. I don't quite know why. It may have been something to do with war mobilisation, or it could have been fear about hell no, I need to go back and take a look at the data to be sure. But you can see it's trending down, heading down towards a tiny level of increase, well under $1 trillion per annum. And then about a year after the crisis begins, once the GDP starts to turn down, then you get an increase in public sector debt. Okay, and now what you're worried about is this gap here is the amount you're accumulating each year, which the fiscal cliff is trying to stop growing. Well, now what I'm going to do, I'll just illustrate one important point here that I talk about in the document. There's 2 years here where the private sector is actually heavily reducing its level of debt. Okay? It isn't just a case of the debt growing more slowly than income, which was the case for the previous 6 decades. It's literally reducing the level of debt outstanding. It fell from about 43 trillion to about $38 trillion. Now it's flatlining. So I'll just actually jump back one slide just to show you that little feature I didn't quite emphasise. Notice how you reached a peak, serious decline in the level of debt, and then it's been flatlining for about 2 years. I'm going to come back to the dangers of this happening again. Okay? That's the thing. My biggest worry about the fiscal cliff is the potential to restart that process. So that's the deleveraging period. Now let's take a look at the picture in terms of how I define effective demand, which is GDP plus the change in debt. So I'm taking that GDP figure, and then I'm going to add on the change in private debt, and then I'm going to add on the change in private and public debt to show you just what the scale of turnaround was in effective demand in the economy when the crisis began. And I think now you'll see why the crisis was so damn huge. So the bottom line is GDP alone. This line, the darkish line on your screen, is the GDP plus the change in private debt. And the blue line is GDP plus a change in both private and public debt. So looking at the American economy when the crisis began, it was about a $14.5 trillion economy in GDP terms. But in terms of private sector spending, it was almost $18.5 trillion. Now that's spending which goes not just on buying goods and services, but also on buying assets. That was where Flip That House was being financed, speculation on Wall Street, IPOs, leverage buyouts, all that sort of thing. So you've gone from this stage of an $18.5 trillion economy down to an $11.5 trillion one in 2 years. That's why your asset markets collapsed, that's why unemployment exploded. It's a huge change. When you add on the government's debt finance expenditure, that boosted spending by about $500 billion there, but down in the depths of the crisis, it was boosting it by $1.5 trillion. So what it meant is rather than having a fall from an $18.5 trillion to an $11.5 trillion economy, you had a fall from roughly 19 to roughly 13. So rather than virtually $7.5, $8 trillion turnaround, it's about a $6 trillion. That's still big, okay, but it's much less than it would have been if the government spending hadn't been there. And a lot of that some of that spending was deliberate. The $700 billion stimulus package that Obama brought in his first term, but a lot of it's also unavoidable. Your tax receipts fall, your welfare payments go up. You must have that increase. Now look up here, and we're seeing that was a huge rate of decline in private debt, which could have continued. And I'll show you what happened during the Great Depression. It did continue. But instead, it turned around very rapidly. And now at this point, we're back to the point where there's no particular change in the level of private debt over time. It's flatlining. So when I look at the flatlining of the rate of change, therefore the gap between the red line, which is the contribution increasing private debt makes to spending, it's pretty much making no contribution at all, neither increasing nor decreasing. But the government spending is still adding about $1 trillion to effective spending in the economy. And what you're talking about is reducing that by $500 billion. Okay. That means you're going to go from about a $17 trillion economy to a $16.5 trillion economy. But that's if you don't do anything to disturb that massive private debt that's still hanging over the economy. And that's my fear, you will disturb that level by doing it. Now I want to show you why it matters, because again, when I've tried to make this case with even progressive economists like Paul Krugman, he'll come back to me and say, why does it matter? And the only reason, the only time that even the progressive end of the conventional economic spectrum thinks that change in debt matters is after you hit what they call the zero lower bound, when the Federal Reserve was forced by the crisis to reduce its reserve rate to 0.125%. They're saying after that point there's going to be what they call a liquidity trap. So after that point, yes, there'll be some sort of relationship between change in debt and the level of unemployment, but beforehand, no, there won't be. This is no relationship. Take a look. That is the unemployment rate. This is the change in private debt, and this one here is the change in public debt. Now, when you take the unemployment ranging from 0 over here to 12% up here, and this is the change of debt being measured on the other axis, and you can see they're almost like Rorschach plots, images of each other. Okay? When change of debt, when the rate of change of debt increases, the level of unemployment falls. That's not saying rising debt's a good thing all the time. There's a certain level of debt you need. Private debt finances investment, that's necessary. When it finances speculation and gambling, as it did during the subprime, it's catastrophic in the long run. But nonetheless, it still employs real estate agents, valuers, etc., etc. So there is a relationship between rising debt and falling unemployment. And the correlation coefficient, for those of you used to working this way, is minus 0.94. Across that period of time. That's all, virtually perfect correlation. On the other hand, here's public debt. Now notice public debt rises when unemployment rises. So you've got to think about what's actually going on there. Does rising public debt cause unemployment? No, it's obviously the other way around. The public debt rises when unemployment rises because the economy slows down, tax receipts drop, unemployment benefits rise. So there's a very, very strong causal relationship between the change in debt and the state of the economy. And I can go much further than this, data going back a long, long way, strengthening that case. This is just to get through in 14 slides. Now also, this change in debt doesn't just finance the real economy, it also finances asset markets. So all that flip that house stuff that Americans had great fun playing, and my country is still playing, unfortunately. We haven't got away from the bubble down in Australia. What actually drove those house prices was accelerating private debt. And if you look at the correlation between the rate of change of mortgage debt as a percentage of GDP and the rate of change of real house prices, again the correlation is very powerful. I can go more detailed again and show a relationship between accelerating debt and changing house prices, and I get a similar correlation to what I've got here. One drives the other. So this is really showing you what you can call a Ponzi economy or a Madoff economy, driving up asset prices, causing apparent wealth, and then of course the crash coming in on top of that. Let's go back to the 1930s, because what I want to now do is try to make some argument from historical precedent about what you could experience if you go through the fiscal cliff without attenuating its impact. Now first of all, of course that was a much more severe, crisis. So here I've got the nominal and real change in GDP. The nominal was worse, of course, because as well as falling output, you had deflation, falling prices. So the nominal fall in GDP from about $115 billion, and by the way, it is $1 billion. It's a lot. The inflation has doubled, increased things by a factor of 2 over that time period, an exponential factor of 2. But you went from a GDP of about 115 billion down to one of 55 billion. In nominal terms, and even in real terms, about a 30% fall over just 3 years, an incredibly sharp crisis, so much worse than what we've been through this time round. The question is, why? Was it because the crisis back then was much worse than now? Was there a bigger level of debt and a bigger speculative bubble? We all know about the Roaring '20s. I'm sure some of us are going to go and watch The Great Gatsby shortly. Okay, that's the image we have of this speculative excess. Well, I'm afraid they have got nothing on Gen Y. Because this is the same chart now showing the level of debt, private debt, public debt, and level of GDP. And you can just tell visually, private debt was higher than GDP during the Great Depression, but by nowhere near the scale we've been through this time round. So the scale of debt finance was much larger this time round, and government debt, again, the same sort of thing. Notice it's flat lines, and then when the crisis hits, it starts to rise. The same sort of causal relationship. Well, let's now drill down one step further and look at GDP plus the change in debt. And what you'll find is that there was a much longer period where the private sector delevered. And a possible explanation for why they spent this extended time deleveraging is because the public sector contribution was so weak compared to what we've been through this time round. The private sector continued to panic and delever because the public sector didn't attenuate the effect of the downturn. So now I have GDP as the top line there, and you can see the plunge in nominal GDP. The top line here is private debt, change in private debt. The blue line is change in government debt. Now notice the period of deleveraging here was 4 years long, whereas this time was only a 2-year period. From 1930 right out to 1934, the private sector was reducing its level of debt. And by reducing its debt, therefore, private sector spending was less than income, whereas the normal situation in a growing economy is private spending is greater than income. So that level of depressed spending, no investment taking place, demand not turning up in shops, etc., etc. And then you had another period of 2 years more of it. So you actually double dipped into depression. We tend to forget that, but that was a crucial period. That's why I want to come back and say, what does that tell us about what might happen with the fiscal cliff? And notice the increase in public spending, as you can tell by remember the previous chart I've shown you with the situation now, far smaller than what we've been through this time round. Even though we see the New Deal as an exemplar of government spending and trying to stimulate a depressed economy, the scale of Obama's stimulus program and lot spending was bigger than the New Deal. It didn't build any Hoover dams, but it was bigger than the New Deal. Let's now take a look at the effect and effective demand. So I'm adding together the change in debt and to GDP. And again, you can tell visually that the bubble in the 1920s was nowhere near as big as the one we've been through now. And the public sector was not making any contribution at all to spending when the bubble began. We had a period where the government was actually spending on top of the borrowing by the private sector, which is in some ways accentuating the level of the bubble before we went into the crash. Then there's this long period where spending is below GDP, and the government slowly starts to increase its spending, but as you can see, the gap between those two lines tells you how large the deficit was, how much debt finance spending was going into the economy from the government, and it was fairly minor. And only by the time the New Deal came along was there any real impetus to government spending. But even that didn't last all that long. It petted out over here, and I'll take you into a bit more detail in the next couple of slides, but I think the government thought the worst is behind us, crisis is over, they slowed down their spending, and what happened was the private sector began deleveraging again. I can illustrate that on another chart here. So what you had was a dip back into depression. So here now we're looking at unemployment and the change in both private debt and public debt, and you can see that gigantic drop in private debt, seeing that as a percentage of GDP, a huge period. And again, that dip there is like the little dip I showed you beforehand. We went through the very V-shaped one. That was, we had discussions some time ago, V-shaped versus U-shaped recovery. We had a V-shaped recovery in terms of the Great Depression. They had a U-shaped experience. Now, the reason why this may be U-shaped is government debt, first of all, wasn't sustained. Again, I think under Hoover, there was a belief the crisis was over. You remember that famous talk when I think Hoover had a few welfare people turn up to him and he said, "Gentlemen, you're 3 months too late, the Depression is over." I think that was in 1931, 32. Then Roosevelt comes in, the New Deal, and a great boost of spending, but then it starts to decline once more. Now notice unemployment skyrockets to 25%. It falls under the influence of the New Deal at last. Not with any, there's some volatility there clearly, but it's heading down. I think at this stage, the feeling in government was the worst is behind us, we can start getting our own books in order now. So you can see a decline in the level of government debt as a percentage of GDP, quite marked. And then the private sector started deleveraging again. Because the demand wasn't being pumped into the economy through the government spending, and suddenly the businesses weren't getting that revenue, they had to worry about their debts, which were still massive compared to where they were in the early 1920s, and they started paying their debt down again, and bang, unemployment went from about 10% back up to 20%. Now the recovery was driven by World War II, and I hadn't actually pulled this data apart myself before putting this presentation together for Dennis. So I had the ratio data but not the actual raw numbers. So what you find is the deleveraging that ended the crisis and got us back to the level where private debt is what it should be, which is something of the order of between 50 and 75% of GDP, where it reached a peak of 300, still about 250. That period of deleveraging only really took off when the government spending went through the roof, when all stops were out. Nobody debated whether there should be a deficit to fight Hitler, okay, or the Japanese. So that total dedication to spending whatever it takes to win the war, then you had this huge increase in government debt. And with that huge increase in government debt, the private sector, which had only slightly delevered, as you can see here, that's the maximum level of private debt, about $170 billion in 1929-30, paid down, and then it flatlines for all those years. There's the dip. Now, it doesn't take much of a downturn, a reduction in private debt to cause a crisis. That's what caused the explosion in unemployment again. Then private debt rose, probably as firms were leveraging up and gearing up to build the armaments that won the Second World War. But then with this huge level of government spending, finally there's a radical deleveraging by the private sector at the end of the crisis with very little impact on GDP. Okay? By that stage, we got ourselves out of the crisis. Now, taking a look at the total period and really going further on, you can see that it wasn't austerity that ended the crisis. It was government spending on a grand scale. This is now looking at the change in private debt, change in public debt. Were it not for that dramatic increase in public debt during the Second World War, the Depression could have lasted maybe another decade. And what I see that being caused by is this huge overhang of private debt that was taken on for speculative reasons, that has to be worked out of the economy to get it back to the stage where the economy is functional once more. But that can cause, as we've seen in Japan, 2 decades of sluggish economic performance. And that's the danger I see for America, that's likely to go through. So now looking at the long run picture of the effective demand story, you can see the downturn caused by the Great Depression, the second one caused by, I believe, the government worrying too much about its own accounts in 1937 and believing the crisis was over, and then the whole thing being ended only by the attempt to fight the Second World War. Well, that's my full picture, so some takeaway points at the end there. First of all, private debt and public debt both matter, not just one, okay? And they're independent to some extent. Again, this is something where I differ from a lot of my fellow non-orthodox economists who argue that one is the mirror image of the other. That's not true. And in the accounting sense, when you record it at the end and treat the entire private sector, including the banks, as one entity, then it's true that if you make one entity as public and the other as private, because of the accounting balances that occur, a deficit of one is perfectly matched by a surplus of the other. However, when you break the private sector down and include the banking sector in there, then the private sector, which borrows from the private banks, can increase or decrease its debt levels independently of what the government does. But the real danger is they affect each other, fairly subtle ways. Now, if you have a period of rising private debt, that can enable the public sector to pay its debt down, which we saw the normal situation from the 1950s right through to when the crisis began. Equally, when the private sector debt starts plunging, public debt's likely to rise. But it's possible for each group to make independent decisions about what to do, which is what the fiscal cliff is about. Now, I think if you then have the government deciding to cut its debt, that could actually trigger a renewal of the payment process of paying down the debt by the private sector. And I call that level of debt the Rock of Damocles. You know the old story of the Sword of Damocles. I see that's what the fiscal cliff is for you. It's the sword hanging over Congress saying, make a decision or it drops on the 31st of December. But my danger is the Rock of Damocles, is that huge hump of debt still sitting there in the private sector. And if the fiscal cliff triggers that renewed downward process, then that will come down and crush the economy once more back into a downturn. So you have all these complex dynamics we need to be careful about. We have to make private debt the important focus here. Okay? One of these days getting public debt down may matter, will matter, but not now. And that's because, first of all, private debt is so much larger. Again, this is not common knowledge, but it's in the flow of funds, easy to find the data, and it's the driving factor. Generally speaking, the public sector is responding to what the government does. The government debt's responding to what the private economy does. But if it tries to take a causal role, it could trigger that process with private debt. And of course, that caused the crisis with the collapse in private debt, and the government debt only rose because of that private debt collapse, and that reduced the severity of the crisis. So we're still believing we're not in a crisis right now, or it's over behind us. I think it's the same sort of thinking as back in 36, 37. Now, premature end to that, we could show that renewed deleveraging by the private sector, and then you wouldn't just have a $500 billion slab taken out of the economy, you might get a $2.5 trillion slab taken out of the economy. It's really got that potential to it. So the main challenge of public policy is not to reduce government debt, but to shift the debate so we focus upon that private debt and see that as the real thing we have to control. And that takes statesmanship, not simply slashing budgets. Thank you.
Any questions of Professor King? In order, keep in mind that he may not be into the weeds as far as our politics, but this is somewhat provocative in terms of the received wisdom
Yeah.
that we have here on the Hill right now, which is there's a very strong feeling among some that government spending has to be cut. But you're saying that you do that and you're going to see some deleveraging by the public sector.
Private sector,
or
yeah.
Private sector,
Yeah.
and then you're looking at at more of an economic slide.
That's right, because again, we're just focusing upon the public sector debt reduction and then seeing what that does to GDP. That's the conventional debate. But if it does it to GDP plus change in private debt, then there's an enormous potential still for reduction in private debt to reduce spending even further. And so rather than, if you see the figures, this is one way to think about the work you may have seen by Olivier Blanchard recently for the IMF, where they were quite proponents of austerity. They were saying, in austerity, each $1 cut in government spending will at worst cause a $0.50 fall in GDP. Well, they then recalibrated after trying it in the sad countries of Southern Europe and found it was a $1 cut in government spending caused a $1.7 cut in GDP. But a lot of that spending itself was debt finance, so part of where that multiplier comes from is the impact upon the private debt level. And again, with $40 trillion roughly, or $38, $39 trillion of private debt sitting there, any attempt to delever by households or by the financial sector's own debt or by private corporations, and you could see a very large amplifier of what the government does in reducing demand.
So we cut government spending right now, we could be in effect jumping off the cliff.
Very good expression. I won't even try to top it.
Any questions?
I assume your concern is about austerity that would happen immediately in terms of fiscal cliff.
Yeah.
About a long-term
Yeah.
that would produce future growth in debt.
Yeah. It's what you're talking about. What, a $500 billion cut, effectively?
Obviously, you're talking about very immediate impacts.
Yeah.
Tax and spending side.
Yeah. On the 1st of January.
Long-term spending reductions, you would not have the same concern about.
No.
Will it kick in?
Yeah.
Next year.
Yeah. You have to be very careful. It's ultimately you do want to reduce public sector debt, but that's ultimately so far in the future. It's not an important issue, and this public sector debt finance is a large part of what's productive in an economy to begin with. It's lack of awareness about that. We've had about 30 or 40 years where economic debate has tried to denigrate the role of government in the economy, and I'm a critic of some aspects of government spending, and I'm not a mainstream. Government's always good by any stretch, but you have to see there's a role for the government in providing infrastructure, maintaining the capital base of the entire country, and we've denigrated that in the last 30 or 40 years in the debate. And really what's happened while we've been denigrating that, we've been ignoring this enormous private debt bubble, which rather than financing anything productive, largely financed asset bubbles. Yeah?
Do we already see some of this effect in fear from small businesses because of what may happen?
Yeah, and this is often what happens. Again, conventional economic theory tries to say the public sector goes one day, the private sector will go the opposite direction. But often what happens is the public sector goes one way, the private sector will go the same way. So you mentioned the public sector decides to build a highway, between here and Baltimore, whatever. Well, you'll see private people making a decision to take out loans to build 7-Elevens along the highway. So there is a way they feed off each other. They're not always in contradiction with each other. So if you have the small businesses looking at it now and saying, hell, they'd actually know where their customers work. Their customer coming in and chatting to them and saying, I'm not sure I'm going to have a job on 1st of January. And the small business person in that situation is not going to be running up a large overdraft, not going to be considering expanding. So you'd get the downturn in government spending triggering a downturn in private spending as well.
Well, and on that note, just I'm the SBA administrator for this region. And so we, in this region, have 3 times more government contractors than any other region in the U.S.
I'm not amazed.
So it's been a great experience. And we see this as a huge problem because that domino effect that you're talking about is really, really important to our
Yeah.
businesses. And those contractors, when we talk about asking them to diversify, I was in a conversation 2 days ago where I'm like, so what should I tell my folks? What should I tell my regions? And they're saying, well, they should start exporting. I'm like, well,
Exporting
exporting
from Washington?
from actually we're Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania.
Well, it's reasonable. Okay, yeah.
But we're not big exporters.
No.
We're not. And so asking them to diversify with not providing the right infrastructure and framework is going to be a really tough one.
And the other thing, of course, so exporting is one of the few things that's totally a zero-sum game. You know, if you're trying to export your way out of it, and China's trying to export their way out of it, and Australia, we can't do it. Okay, it's not a solution that everybody can do. So it's again that's the sort of advice you give when you haven't got any advice and you want to say something that doesn't make you sound totally stupid. But if you think about it, it does make you totally stupid. Yeah.
What you recommend then, because obviously whether we should let the Bush tax cuts expire or be extended or just, expire and raise the rates in the middle or on the upper class, what do you think?
I think
that tie in?
I think you've got the right to change your distribution of tax. I mean, that talk about removing the tax cuts from the upper levels, but balance it by tax. Removing tax benefits at the top level, providing them down the lower level. You still need government spending programs. That's all necessary. But ultimately, I don't think this is. If you imagine what it took us to get out of the Great Depression and how long it took and the pain that was involved in all that, and look at where we are now and see we've actually got, when we started the crisis, 1.7 times the level of private debt they had back in the end of the 1920s. So we've got ourselves a bigger hole we've dug ourselves into. I really don't think we can get out of it without deliberately reducing the debt by government action. And what I mean, I don't mean by government spending, I mean deciding to write off the debt. Now, I don't know enough about this particular historical phase. I want to go back and read about it. But when Roosevelt came into power, one of the very first things he did was the bank holiday. Banks were shut down, I'm not sure over the period of time. Was it you'd know, Stephen, do you have any idea?
Banks were already shutting down before he did that.
It wasn't a holiday, it was just, closed forever, yeah.
It wasn't a write-off of the bank debts at that point in time.
Okay.
And I think you're right, it was World War II.
That really did it.
Really,
yeah.
About World War II and all that expense. And then, when it was for war, the banks had no objection to creating money. None whatsoever.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't do it at all.
Yeah.
For the good program.
So I'm actually arguing what I call a modern debt jubilee, because if you look back historically, ancient civilization, we used to have jubilees. The story was once every 50 years, or 49 years most likely, and once every time a king changed. After the Sumerian Empire, that became instituted every 50 years. Literally all debts were eliminated. That was a known pattern in society. Debt slaves were freed and so on. Michael Hudson's done some great historical work on that and why that happened. We've got to the stage where we think creditors must be protected. Debt can't be written off. If you took out the debt, it's the responsibility of the debtors, etc., etc. But we think about it, what was that debt created to do? And who had the brain power in the negotiations over the level of debt? Was it the people lending the money or the people borrowing it? Now, you've had this most bizarre situation where people who had no known capacity to pay, the old ninja loans, were being lent money by people with managers paying themselves multi-million dollars and more PhDs than you could poke Cape Canaveral at. So the brain power and the responsibility, and I think the moral side of it, was on the side of the lenders, not the borrowers. The borrowers actually were trusting banks because that's one thing you should be able to do. A capitalist system functions well when you can trust the banks. But there's abuse of trust in the banks. They created debt they should never have created, should never have been allowed to be created, and they should never have been allowed to sell it to people in the public either through securitized loan, which they have done. So I've got this incredible mess. And if you try to forgive debtors now, a lot of people who see themselves as savers, because they've bought bonds, they've got no debt and so on and so forth, they'd say, what about moral hazard? You can't let the debtors off. Now my feeling is we have to acknowledge that, but a way to do that is to make a government cash injection, so Federal Reserve created, and they can do it under Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act. If you check Section 13.3, you can see the Federal Reserve can directly give money to private institutions. It doesn't have to give them to the banks alone. Takes emergency situation, but they can do it. Give a cash injection, which goes to people on a per capita basis. I really haven't tried to work out details of this, but something like that. And then if you're in debt, let's say you got $100,000 per person. If you had debt, you would have to pay the debt down, no choice. The $100,000 would reduce your debt by $100,000, and that would be it. If you are not a debtor, you'd get $100,000 into your deposit account, which you could spend. Now this would feed through the system, so the banks would be forced to write their debt down because they're having the debt paid off. Securitized loans which were backed by that debt will also fall in value, so people who are savers would see the value of those bonds decline, but they'd be compensated by the cash injection. So something like that as a deliberate policy to reduce the level of debt, I think is necessary. And in fact, in Germany, a couple of groups are now working on what they're calling a debt audit, which is to work out who owes what, who owns the debt, and what should the level of debt be compared to income, to try to work out what level that might be operated at. I think an audit like that would be a very sensible thing to do. Yeah, Jamie.
Steve, you mentioned before that you think a sustainable level of private debt is between about 50 and 75%.
Yeah.
So it's quite a way to go to get to that.
That's the scary thing. I mean, it's hard to work out what the level is. You'd need to really look and see what is debt used for. And for example, the sensible reasons to use debt in a market economy like ours is for investment, when you want to invest more than retained earnings. That's a large part of where industrial growth and technological change comes from. And there are consumption items we can't afford to buy with our income, like buying a house and buying a car and so on. So there's necessary consumption, which has to be debt financed, and there's investment above retained earnings, which has to be debt financed. So the more entrepreneurial your society is, the more that investment debt finance will be necessary. In my country, Australia, had a 20-year period from 1945 to 65 where the debt ratio for the entire private sector, households and businesses, was 25% of GDP. Now, that's probably because we don't do much innovation down there. You know, we don't have the General Motors and the General Electrics and all the stuff your country's been famous for, doing that industrial development. So you need to borrow money for that. That might account like an additional 25% of GDP. So of that order, I think 50 to 75. But that's almost 2 years worth of GDP below where you are now.
I want to thank you for taking this time to share these years of research that you've done with members of congressional staff and committee staff. This is a very important time for us to consider these points that you raised, particularly when Congress is about to make some decisions that without enough thought could end up being counterproductive. So I'm going to make sure that we get the information out to members and to staff who are not able to attend, and to make sure that this great work that you've done gets broad consideration. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks very much.